Welcome students to another episode of Learning with Lafferty. Within this video, I'm going to be talking about the male and female reproductive system. Now, like always, Manee has to join us. And of course, Manee, you are a male manatee, so we're going to be talking about the parts that you would have. And of course, I am a female, so I'm going to be talking about the parts that the female system will have. So within this video, it is important to understand that both male and female have organs that are going to house special cells, and when those cells come together, that is where you're going to have reproduction. Now, reproduction itself that we're going to be looking at is looking at these special cells, specialized, called gametes, okay? Or the game plan is on when the two gametes join each other. Now, it's important to understand that all of this is controlled by hormones that I would have talked about in the beginning part of the endocrine system. So let's talk about the parts of the male and the female reproductive system. Now, the specialized sex cells, gametes, are germ cells, is another name that you will hear. And that will really help you if you know that germ cells, when I talk about within the next video of how that the body, when it has come together, so one egg and one egg join each other, so one cell and one cell become one together, of that plan of the embryonic stage. Okay, so germ cells will be important into a future video. Now, in a male, these specialized gametes are called sperm. Spermatoza is the name for a sperm. The gamete, the specialized sex cells in a man. And on the woman's side, those specialized sex cells are called ova or ovum. Now, it's important to understand in the male and female reproductive system the main organs. Okay, now we have primary organs and we have accessory organs. Now, I want to talk briefly about both, but definitely be focusing on the primary organs because those are the ones where the sex cells are made and mature, and that is important. So, gonads is a name you need to know. So, gonads are also called sex glands. They produce the gametes, and then they're also going to manufacture hormones to support these gametes. Now, 46 is the main number of chromosomes that we have, and that will be divided in half because half our genetics comes from dad and half of our genetics come from mom. So 46, take that in half, that's 23 on this side and 23 on that side. And that will be through a process called meiosis. So the gonads are going to produce the gametes, okay, sperm and egg, and manufacture also various hormones. Now, the male gonad is the testes, or testicles, and on the female side is going to be the ovary, or ovaries. Now, the accessory organs we're going to look at are just a series of ducts that we're going to transport these gametes, these sex cells, as well as secrete various exocrine secretions in those glands. Now, it's very important to understand in both the female and male reproductive system, there are special areas called the primary organs. The fancy name is called the gonads. Now, in a man, the gonads are the testes, and in a woman, the gonads are the ovaries. Now, inside of the primary organs of reproduction, we find these things called gametes. Now, I kind of say the game plan is on because when a sperm and an ova or ovum egg meets, then we're going to have pregnancy. So we'll talk about that within the next video. So the gametes inside of a man held and produced and maturing inside of the testicles are sperm, and the gametes inside of the ovaries of a woman are called the ova or ovum, or sometimes even called the egg. We are going to look here in more detail about what happens inside of the gonads, in each one, male and female, and then we're going to look at what happens later videos when the gametes meet each other and conception happens. Now, the sperm are definitely going to have to travel through a series of duct systems. along with the ova travels through a series of duct systems. Now, depending upon, obviously, within the ovaries, once that egg is released, if there is conception that happened due to a sperm that has met an ovum, that's where we're going to have pregnancy. And we'll look at that within future videos. So I want to start first by talking about the male reproductive system. The function of the male reproductive system is to manufacture the sperm, the sex cells, and then, of course, obviously, if we're trying to get pregnant, to have them brought to the egg. Now, this system entails the following: 2 testes, testicles, which are the site of sperm production, and then the accessory organs. Now, the accessory organs are going to be the following: an epidermis, a ductus or vas deferens, and the ejaculatory duct. So now let's look at the parts of the testicle. Now, I'll talk about them here briefly, and then you're going to have a demonstration of the parts of the male reproductive system next. Now, one thing about the testicles that is important to understand, that the testicles are held on a man in a sac called the scrotum. Now, the scrotum itself is going to help to cool down the testicles, because that is where the sperm is going to be made, and that is where the sperm needs to start the process of meiosis. Now, inside of the testicle, you're going to see these tiny little coiled seminiferous tubules, and this is the primary cells that were going to make and produce the sperm. Now, there are specialized intracellular cells within the testicles that are going to make the hormone of testosterone. Now, testosterone is going to help to make the sperm, and also are going to help to produce the sperm. So testosterone is found within the testes of the male reproductive system. Testosterone, to even be made within the testicles, they are under the control of 2 hormones that we would have talked about under the anterior pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are 2 protein hormones. So follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the cells within the testicles to produce growth factors to promote the formation of the sperm. And luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the interstitial cells between those seminiferal tubules inside the testicles to produce the testosterone, which is needed for cell development, the cell maturing. Now, starting at puberty, the hypothalamus within a male is going to secrete a gonadotropin releasing hormone that triggers the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and then these hormones are continuously secreted in an adult man. Now, remember, this is a feedback loop, so that circulating concentration of the testosterone is kept very relatively consistent by that negative feedback mechanism. As the blood levels of testosterone increase, the hypothalamus is going to secrete less of its hormone. And as the levels of testosterone decrease in the blood, the hypothalamus then will secrete more of the gonad-releasing hormone. So it's a very tight loop system that the body helps to regulate testosterone within the testicles. Now, testosterone's main job, I already mentioned it, is to help to develop and also maintain the production of sperm and help to mature the sperm. Now, there are some secondary effects that you will get from testosterone in both a male and a female, but are not directly concerned with reproduction itself. Now, in a man, these traits are going to be that deeper voice, broader shoulders, narrower hips, because obviously they're not giving birth, but a greater percentage of it goes to the muscle tissue and more body hair And you can also find those traits within a woman because we're born with the same type of hormones, but in lesser levels. So it still would be the hypothalamus that would be making and producing this as needed. Now, as sperm is made in response to testosterone inside of the seminephral tubercles, the sperm is going to change through the process of maturing because of the correct level of testosterone. Now, sperms are considered to be individual cells, and they are so small that at least 200 million can be contained in a tablespoon of semen. Now, beginning at puberty is where these sperm cells are manufactured continuously due to the levels of testosterone. Now, during their maturing, it's going to change the way that the sperm looks. So the sperm does start out just like in a woman, the ovum, the egg, looking like an egg. So a good representation to view of how it looks is think about a frog. Okay, look at frog eggs and how eventually frog eggs grow then a tail, and then they'll eventually grow arms and legs, and then eventually become a frog. Okay, so there's a good representation of what really sperm development does look like. Now, the sperm itself is going to have a head, and within that head is going to be the nucleus that contains the chromosomes. Okay, now on top of that head is going to be an enzyme called a chromosome. Now, a chromosome is going to cover it almost like a helmet, and it's going to contain a special enzyme that's going to help the sperm penetrate the ovum egg when it meets it. So it's an enzyme that helps to break down the coating of the ovum. Now, in the middle section of the sperm, you're going to find a mid-piece, which is called the mitochondria area. Now, if you remember anything about mitochondria, that's where all the energy to help move the sperm and give it energy to propel it throughout the duct system that we're going to look at within the male reproductive system. But then once it leaves the man, we're going to look at how far it has to travel to go into the female system. So the head has their chromosome, the enzymes, and it contains the DNA, the nucleus. Then you're going to have a midsection, a mid-piece, which is going to contain the mitochondria. Lastly, that projection that comes off of that cell that it will grow during that process of maturing is going to be called the flagella or flagellum. Okay, it's the only cell membrane projection that would have talked about under the cell chapter in the human body is on the sperm. The tail of the sperm is called the flagella. It's going to help like a rudder in a boat to direct the sperm which direction it needs to go. Now, as the sperm is maturing, it is going to be traveling through the duct system to get it from testicle out of penis. Now, the testicle itself, the series of tubes, begins with the epidermis. So those seminephral tubercles will end up on top of the testicle. And again, remember, the testicle is encased inside of your scrotum. That tube system begins with the epidermis. Now, the epidermis itself on the surface of the testes, during about the second or third day through the epidermis, the sperm cells are going to mature and be able at that point to start moving by themselves. Now, the epidermis extends then upwards into the abdominal cavity, and that region is called the ductus or vastus deferens. And this tube loops over the pubic bone and curves behind the man's urinary bladder. Now, the ductus deferens widens to form a duct system that's going to start the secretion of liquids called semen. Now, the three different glands that will secrete liquids within a man are first the seminal vesicle on the same side to form a duct called the ejaculatory duct. Seminal vesicle is going to secrete a mixture of sperm cells, alkaline secretion, that is going to help to nourish the sperm on its journey outside of the body. It makes up the majority of the semen. Now, the prostate would be the second gland in this area. Now, the ducts from the prostate gland carry the secretions into the urethra. Again, they're also producing that alkaline-based secretion to help neutralize the acidity of vaginal secretions. And the last type of gland we have within the male reproductive system is the bulbal urethral gland, also called the Cowper glands. They're going to help secrete some mucus to lubricate the urethra so that the sperm can easily leave the penis. And lastly, surrounding the urethra is the duct of the penis. So when I talked about in the urinary bladder, the tail that comes off of it is going to be called the urethra. In a male, the urethra is the same tube that semen is going to come out of during ejaculation. Now, the penis itself is considered part of the external genitalia along with the scrotum, even though the testicles itself is considered to be the gonad, the primary sex organ. Now, the penis itself is made out of spongy material, which allows, when blood has reached it, for an erection to happen to allow and encourage more of the sperm to leave the testicles. Now, one area to note that you need to know about the penis is the foreskin called the prepuce. That would be the skin that would be removed during circumcision. Now, one thing to point out about the word semen that I've talked about, it has those different glands, secretions from those glands mixed with sperm. There are anywhere from 2 to 5 milliliters of semen, and within that you'll find anywhere from 50 to 150 million sperm per milliliter. Those sperm can only live up to a few hours, but sometimes some of those sperm can live upwards of 7 days outside of the testicles. Now watch this next demonstration of the parts of the male reproductive system. Within this demonstration, I want to show you the parts and names associated with the male reproductive system and the path that the sperm is going to travel and where it is housed, produced, and matures. Now, the first place we're going to start off is the testes. Now, the testes are the area or the testicles in a man called the gonads. Now, the gonads house gametes, and gametes are going to be the sex cells that allow reproduction to occur. Now, we'll look in more detail in a minute of the parts inside of the testes and the hormone associated with the testes. But as the sperm is produced and maturing inside of the testes, it is going to go through a series of tubes inside the testes, and as it matures, then it's going to move up to the top of a series of duct systems to allow the sperm to go from testes to penis. And let's look at the names along the way. So as the sperm moves up, it's going to move into the epidermis, which is a duct system that is on top of the testes. Then it's going to move down the side of the testes through a tube system called the ductus deferens. And as it then continues up the sperm, it's going to go past into the abdominal cavity, the bladder, and then as it is passing the bladder, it's going to go by a series of glands. The glands will be the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral, or also called Cowper's gland. These 3 glands are going to secrete liquids that is going to nourish and help to protect the sperm as it leaves the body, and then eventually if it enters into the vaginal canal. So we left off at the bladder. It's heading past those glands. The next portion is going to call the ejaculatory duct, and that's where it's going to join with the urethra. So urine that's held in the bladder will travel through the urethra, and semen that was in the ejaculatory duct will then travel down both into the penis to travel out of the body. So the path again is from testes to epidermis, which is a duct, ductus deferens, which is the next part of the duct system, past the bladder into the ejaculatory duct. It will pass 3 glands along the way: seminal vesicle, prostate, and the calprins, also known as the bulbourethral gland. Then as it enters the ejaculatory duct, it will pass by the urethra, and urine and semen will leave the penis, which is also considered to be a duct system. Now, very important to understand about the penis that it does have spongy tissue inside of it to allow it to expand. Now, within the penis, you're going to find the urethra, which is going to allow urine to leave from the bladder. And also something important about the penis is prepudence, which is also known as the foreskin, that will be removed during circumcision. So the penis is also a part of the duct system that allows sperm to leave the body. But in the male reproductive system, it also via the urethra allows urine to leave the body. Now, within the testes are going to be special little lobes that hold a series of tubes called the seminephral tuberals. Now, within these tubes, that is where sperm is going to be produced, and it is going to mature as it travels through this series of seminephral tuberals. Now remember, this is held all within the testes, which are the gonads, the primary organ for the male reproductive system. Now, as the seminephral tuberals are developing within the testes, a group of cells called interstitial cells is producing the one hormone that is directly associated with the testicles, and that would be testosterone. Now, testosterone is made in correspondence with the hypothalamus within the brain. Now, the hypothalamus is going to produce a gonadotropin releasing hormone that is going to stimulate follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that will directly affect the cells, the interstitial cells inside of the testicles, and that is going to produce the hormone then of testosterone. Once testosterone levels are high enough, sperms are going to be made within the seminephral tuberals and will mature to eventually exit and go into the abdominal cavity and to leave the body via the duct system. Now, a sperm itself will start off as looking like a circle egg and will eventually, through the maturing process, have a head, a mid-piece or midsection, and a tail. Now, on the head, I've placed a little extra piece here called a chromosome. And a chromosome is what is going to protect, but also allow the egg through those enzymes to penetrate if it meets an ovum, an egg, in the female reproductive system. Now, in the head, you're also going to find the nucleus. And if you remember anything about the nucleus, that is what is going to hold the DNA. The midsection or the body of the sperm is going to have mitochondria to give it lots of energy to propel the sperm. And then the tail is going to be called the flagella or flagellum. And that is going to help, almost like a rudder in a boat, go left and right to help to move the sperm as it is on its journey out of the body. And remember, testosterone is what helps to make the sperm. And as long as a man's testosterone levels are high, he will constantly, continuous through starting at puberty through his whole life, make sperm via the testosterone. And testosterone also helps to change and to give the information such as the body and the tail will grow on the sperm only due to the levels of testosterone. Now, I'm just going to stop here and mention under each one of these. I want to start with the male first, and then I'll talk about the female disorders after I've talked about the female parts. Now, some disorders that can affect the male reproductive system is going to be first the structural disorders. So we can have a failure for the testicles to descend during fetal development. You can also have a twisting or a torquing of when the testicles are not rotated properly within the scrotum. A hernia or a rupture, which refers to an abnormal protrusion of that organ through the wall of the cavity that is held within. An inguinal hernia occurs when a congenital weakness in the abdominal wall allows a portion of the small intestine to pass through the inguinal cavity into the scrotum. Now, besides structural disorders, you can have infections. And remember, infections, ITIS, just look for that. That'd be an infection of a certain part of the body. So such as your prostate could get infection, which is inflammation of that area. The epidermis could have an itis, inflammation. Remember, ITIS stands for inflammation. And then you could also get an inflammation of the testicles themselves. Now, a lot of diseases in this area are caused from sexually transmitted infections, okay, better known as sexually transmitted diseases. The most persistent infection that you will see within this area is genital herpes, syphilis, and warts. Now, just like every other cell in our body, there's always the potential, unfortunately, to get cancer within the male reproductive system. Now, prostate cancer is the most common cancer in males over the age of 50 and can be detected through regular screenings. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about is going to be the female reproductive system. And just like the male, I'm going to have a demonstration here in a little bit to show you the parts. Now, besides the gonads, which are the ovaries, we have to add one more area because all of us, our first apartment that we had inside of mom would have been the uterus. Okay, so the uterus plays a huge role in development, but it is also a part of the female reproductive system you need to know. Now, the ovaries are the primary reproductive organ of the female system because that is where you're going to find the gametes, the ovum or ovium, singular versus plural, the eggs of the system. That's the sex cell. Those gametes then are going to mature just like this sperm matured within the testicles in a man, but the difference between a male versus female system is that men can produce sperm their whole life, starting at puberty, but females are only given a certain amount the moment that you're formed inside of mom. So I have two girls, and I think the neat thing about that is when I, at a certain point, was carrying my daughters, they developed all the eggs they'll ever have of those ovum, those gametes. So technically, at some point when I was carrying my daughters, I was also carrying my grandbabies, which is crazy when you think about that. Now, normal for a woman is 2 ovaries. Okay, obviously a left and a right ovary. Now, they're held in place by ligaments that attach to the uterus. Now, the outer layer of the ovary is a single layer of epithelial tissue. Now, but below that layer is where you're going to find those eggs that are going to be made and forming inside of your embryonic stage. Each individual cell is called an oocyte initially, and each one of these is held within a home called ovarian follicles. So follicles are the little space, the little homes inside of the ovaries that these oocytes will live. The job of this little follicle, this little home, is to protect the ovums and also produce those hormones that I'll talk about here in a few minutes for the ovarian. Now, the ovaries of a newborn female baby contain more than 1 million unmature follicles, but only 100,000 remained viable at puberty. As puberty approaches, a few follicles begin to develop, and those oocytes will enlarge, and those follicle cells then will multiply. During each month of when a woman is eligible at puberty to be having a reproductive cycle, one developing follicle usually goes through that maturing process and then will release its egg. The final stages of development and release are going to be discussed with how the hormones control the cycles of our ovaries. Now, those follicles in a woman, as she goes through reproductive cycles, is releasing those eggs or releasing multiple eggs. Now, we'll look at here later on the journey that those eggs have to take up into the uterus. Now, as those eggs are released, or egg released from its follicle, that follicle has a job that it still wants to play within the body. Ovaries are directly attached to the uterus. There is a way that the ovaries can release a hormone back to the uterus to tell the uterus and warn it if there is a baby potentially heading its direction. Now, those follicles will change the name to corpus luteum. And corpus luteum means yellow body. Now, if an egg has been released and it gets fertilized, that corpus luteum is going to stay a yellow body to secrete a hormone to tell the uterus to not allow menses to happen. And I'll talk about menses in more detail in a minute, but menses is going to be menstruation, the shedding of the walls of the uterus. Now, if there is no egg that is fertilized, no ovum that is fertilized, then that corpus luteum is going to become white and is no longer going to secrete hormones to tell the uterus to not tear the lining, the endothelium of the uterus down. Now, as the egg is released, or eggs are released, there is no direct connection on the releasing side to the uterus directly. Now, the uterus itself has three different parts. It has a fundus at the top, which you will see here in a little bit, a body in the middle, and at the bottom, the most inferior portion of the uterus, the main part, is called the cervix. And of course, the cervix opens up into the vaginal canal. Now, as an egg is released, there are two arm-like structures that come off of the top of the uterus. Now, those arms that come off of the uterus are called the fallopian tubes, or also known as the oviducts. So the end that is nearest to the ovaries is called the fimbriae. It's almost like a little flower that will be near but not physically attaching the ovaries to capture eggs, ovums, as they release during ovulation. Now, once it gets into the fallopian tube, implantation needs to happen closer in the first 1/3 of that fallopian tube to the ovaries. Now, I'll talk about in the next video what happens when there is a sperm that meets up with that egg and conception happens, fertilization happens at that fallopian tube. So that should be the site of fertilization, but should not be the site of implantation. So either the egg did not make it into the fallopian tube, or if it made it into the tube and there was no sperm to fertilize it, it's going to continue its journey out of the body or to be eaten by white blood cells. Now, so it travels from ovary to fallopian tube via the fimbriae, up to the fundus, to the body, to the cervix, and then down the vagina. Now, the vagina itself is classified as the birth canal because that is where the baby would exit if not done through C-section. Now, important to know some layers of the uterus when you relate to the menses, menstruation. Endometrium. Now, endometrium is the inside layer. Myo is the big, thick muscle that's going to play a role in contracting of the uterus. And then peri is going to be in the outside of the uterus. Now, as a whole, the outside external genitalia is called the vulva region. Now, we do have one gland that is going to be within that vaginal canal region called the greater vestibule gland, which is going to secrete liquids to help to lubricate the vagina. Now, in a female, just as in a male, reproductive function is controlled by the gonadotropin hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, that are regulated within the anterior pituitary gland. Now, there is a little slight differences in the female system for its activity. The change that we see in a woman that's different is that process of menstruation, the menstrual cycle, the menses. The period of the menstrual cycle runs anywhere from 22 days upwards of 45 days, with average kind of falling in 28 days. That is the beginning of the day one. Ovulation, the egg being released, happens in the middle. And then, of course, we have another couple weeks after that, and then the cycle starts all over again. Now, during that cycle, the levels of follicle stimulating and hormone and luteinizing hormone must rise in order for ovulation to happen, and then they kind of narrow back down. Now, during that picture, what's happening at the ovaries at the beginning of the cycle are starting to develop those follicles, starting to mature. Then in the middle of the cycle, the ovulation happens. The corpus luteum is yellow until it turns white if there's no fertilization that has occurred. Now, estrogen levels have to peak also, like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, right before ovulation, but progesterone levels need to dip. Now, those levels will directly affect if estrogen and progesterone are the two hormones that are coming from the ovaries. Now, they will directly affect the growth of the endometria inside of the uterus, of whether it's going to shed, we have our menses and bleeding, or it's going to get thicker to withstand life inside of the uterus. So you have two phases, pre-ovulated phase and the post-ovulatory phase. So obviously before the egg is released and after the egg is released. That last phase is very dependent upon the hormones of either thickening the wall for implantation or causing the wall, the endometrium, to become thinner to allow the home basically to be rebuilt enough to sustain life as needed. Now, the word menopause comes from hence no more eggs being released from the ovaries. So since the ovaries play a direct role in connection to the uterus holding a baby, once there's no longer any eggs, there's that lack of hormone levels that will go down, and ovulation will not occur because there are no more eggs in the basket, okay, to be released. So menopause is a pause in the menses. Now watch next of the parts of the female reproductive system. Now within this section, we're going to be talking about the female reproductive system. Now, I want to first off start by talking about the gonads. Now, the gonads in a woman are considered to be the ovaries. So the ovaries are going to house the gametes, which the sex cell on the female side is called an egg, ova, ovum. So these ovas are going to mature inside of the ovaries. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Now, as the egg is maturing inside of the ovaries, it's going to leave on a monthly basis 1 or more eggs during the process of ovulation. Now, ovulation then is going to release that egg or eggs into the next region called fimbriae. So as the eggs mature and released into the uterus, they will get to the uterus via the fimbriae. The fimbriae is the end portion of the fallopian tubes. Now, the fallopian tubes can also be called the uterine tubes or the oviducts. Now, this duct system is directly a portion of the uterus. And you could see on both sides, of course, you would have the fimbriae over here, and you also would have an ovary normally over here. But I'm just going to do one side for you. So, ovaries to fimbriae. But you notice there is not a direct connection between the ovaries and the fimbriae, which is the portion of the fallopian tubes. So on a monthly basis, those eggs could never make it into the fallopian tube, and then they would just go into the abdominal cavity and the white blood cells would eat them. Now, if an egg does get into the fibrea, it will travel up that fallopian tube to go into the beginning portion of your uterus called the fundus. Now, the fundus is the superior portion. The body would be in the middle. And then the last portion of the uterus is called the cervix. And of course, that would be something they would check during pregnancy that I'll talk about in future video. So the uterus also has 3 different linings that you see here. So the outer tissue membrane would be the peritoneum. The next layer, going deeper inside of your uterus, is the myo. And if you remember anything about myo, that means muscle, metrium. That is what's going to cause contraction of the uterus. And endometrium, this is the part, the inner lining of the uterus that will shed during menstruation. So from ovaries to fibrea, down the tube, the fallopian tube, into the fundus. And if implantation happens, it's going to happen more in the body region of the uterus. But if the egg is not fertilized, it's going to continue at the cervix, go down the birth canal, which is also known as the vagina. And in the vagina region, you're going to find one of the glands called the greater vestibule gland that's going to help secrete lubrication that is helpful during intercourse. And then eventually the next region is going to go external genitalia, which in a woman, the whole region is called the vulva. So let's go upwards. Vulva, vagina, that has the only gland, cervix, body, fundus, portions of the uterus, fallopian tube, fibrea, back to the ovaries. Now, there is a connection, and I did not really show it here, but there is a connection where the ovaries through a ligament is also directly connected to the uterus. And in the next video, I'm actually going to show what happens and how that the ovaries directly communicate to the uterus during pregnancy. Now, there are layers you need to know. The most inner layer that is very important is the endometrium. And definitely think about menstruation, the menses as they're called when you think about. That's the part that's shedding and while there's blood coming down the vaginal canal. Now, one thing important, I want to talk about the ovaries. Inside of the ovaries is going to hold the ovums. Now, the ovum is going to be the eggs. Now, the difference between a man and a woman is when you are during embryonic stage as a female, you are actually making and will be housing all the eggs you will ever have in your lifetime. That there are little follicles inside of the ovaries called corpus luteums. Now, these follicles are going to allow those individual little ovums to mature. They're also known as oocytes within these follicles. Now, every month when a woman gets of the age of puberty and starts having menstruation, as those eggs are released from the follicle then is an area that can secrete 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, just like in the man side, testosterone was controlled by the hypothalamus via 2 hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And as these levels rise and are lowered, that is going to cause the estrogen and progesterone levels to also change. And when these levels are correct, then that is going to continue the pregnancy if fertilization is going to occur. And that is something we will look at within the next video. Now, lastly, I want to talk about, just like I did with the male, the female reproductive disorders. The first one would be as far as the menses disorders, menstruation, such as like having no menses when you're still of reproductive age. Obviously, if you're having more painful or too much of the endometria is being discarded, that of course could cause excess bleeding and could also cause problems with the hormone levels. Now, endometriosis itself, that word refers to an overgrowth of the endometrial tissue outside of the uterus, commonly on the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the fallopian tubes. Could even be the pelvic organs themselves. So remember, cancers, a lot of them begin when a cell that should be in an area decides it wants to move or migrate to an area of the body that it should no longer be at. Now, there is a syndrome. Women, we know it. PMS, as it's called, premenstrual syndrome, is characterized by either obviously the physical changes that are happening in the body, but there is that mental, emotional aspect of the up and down roller coaster that our hormones are doing within our body. Now, we have, like anything that I mentioned, we can have different tumors. They can be benign or malignant. And remember, malignant tumors are the ones that metastasize and move to different areas of our body. Now, the infections, a lot of them can be the same like in a man, except for we have a cervix. Okay, so the cervix is the bottom portion that they will check, and I'll talk about that within the next video when we are giving birth, okay, to and being in labor with a baby. But we can get cervical cancer, and cervical cancer has been proven that a virus, HPV, is what can be a contributing factor to cervical cancers. You can also have an inflammatory pelvic disease that results from many infections or a variety of infections, and that, of course, can cause problems with bacteria getting up into the uterus, getting up into the fallopian tube, and causing problems. Now, of course, to prevent male and female, of course, we know the best way if you don't want to have a baby is abstinence, but there is a variety of birth control, and all birth control is contraception. It's an artificial means to prevent fertilization of the ovum. So I'm not going to go into all the birth control methods, but definitely look through the table in your textbook of obviously the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those. But remember, if sperm does not meet egg, you cannot get pregnant. Okay, that's how that works. That's science 101 when it comes to the sexual reproductive organs. So hopefully within this video, talked about the male reproductive system, not as many parts as us, and the female reproductive system. Hopefully you've understood more about how the male and female reproductive systems work. And I look forward to seeing you in next week's video. We're going to talk about, Manee, what happens during the embryonic development once a sperm and an ovum meet. So I look forward to seeing you within the next video.